Once again, the Queen of Consorts surprises us, but not in a good way.
Made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
Nobody in the palace anticipated that the mourning would turn into a wound that would never completely heal. Every face in that private room had the same frozen expression, the one people wear when they know history is going to speak in a voice that is too icy to dispute, and the doors and hallways had been cleared. Even so, the statement itself was not the main source of concern in the room, even with soldiers stationed outside and royal aides deprived of their phones. What would come next was the source of the fear. Because this was more than a constitutional issue. This had nothing to do with status, ceremony, or the crown's fragile machinery. This was about a family, a marriage, and a woman who lived just a few rooms away and was unaware that her life would soon be cut in two. A paper that felt more weighty than a law was in front of King Charles as he stood at the head of the table. Anyone who knew William well enough would have seen the tightness building in his jaw as he sat close to Catherine, stiff and inscrutable. The note in front of her brother was more than just an administrative directive, as Princess Anne had already witnessed enough. With his eyes averted, Prince Edward remained silent as usual, but this was not due to ignorance. It originated from the kind of comprehension that comes before the words, making it worse than shock. Everyone in the room was aware that a decisive event was imminent. They were unsure if the king would sound like a spouse destroying the only person who had supported him during years of humiliation, or if he would still sound like a sovereign when he said it. Charles then raised the proclamation. The fact that his fingers were shaking conveyed more information than the first line could have. When they speak, kings are not supposed to shudder. Men do. And everyone in the room realized that whatever had driven him to this point had already ripped something deep inside of him in that first shaky movement, even before they heard the words. He started reading. He claimed that his wife would no longer carry out the responsibilities and enjoy the rights that come with being queen. She would play a smaller public role. She would no longer have ceremonial authority. For the rest of his reign, she would not remain the monarchy's most prominent female figure. Between the lines, there was no softening language. No shortcuts, no recommendation for a review. There was no assurance that what authority had just determined could be undone by time. There was no loud reaction in the room. It responded in a manner similar to how established institutions respond to injury, with silence. William continued to stare at his father, but it seemed like each word cost him something. He had witnessed Charles's suffering before. He had witnessed him being cornered by the long shadow of decisions that had defined the family for decades, as well as by public rage and personal remorse. However, this was not the same. In order to save the throne's future, this guy was sacrificing his own life. Catherine moved slightly in William's direction, not because she required further explanation, but rather because she was aware of the threat before anyone mentioned it out loud. Someone else would seem to move into the center if Camilla was forced out of it. Additionally, the woman who inherits visibility frequently appears guilty in the harsh language of public perception, even if she never requested it. Anne did not move, but for a while she saw something that no one else did. There was another sheet partially concealed beneath Charles's fingers beneath the page he was reading. This indicated that the official statement did not tell the complete story. This choice was made for a deeper, possibly more agonizing cause. Anne knew when a public explanation was masking an older private split since she had spent enough of her life under royal authority. Without uttering a word, she realized that disobedience was not the only thing that had led them there. It was a betrayal, not the boisterous variety that the media thrives on. The more subdued variety, the kind that manages to change everything while taking place in rooms where very few people are present. The messenger anticipated anger when the news reached Camilla in her private chambers. He anticipated incredulity, possibly even an instant demand to see the king. Instead, he discovered a state of utter silence that seemed out of place. After taking the notice and reading the first few paragraphs, Camilla slowly and visibly grasped the arm of her chair. Her face did not fall apart. Her voice remained unbroken. She just posed one query. Had Charles personally approved each word? Even before it was said, the response was yes. The atmosphere around her was altered by her response. She reread the statement, possibly looking for some indication that this was merely a temporary distance, a tactical retreat, or a correction that would later be softened in private. However, the order contained nothing of the sort. Not a review, there is no conditional language, there is no way back, there was no pause. It was a conclusion cloaked in formal terminology. Additionally, Camilla recognized finality when she saw it, because she had endured years of public disdain to reach her current position. With more consideration than rage, she set the paper down, got to her feet, and made her way to the door. She planned to visit him. William noticed the movement start in another hallway. He was instantly aware of what was about to happen. The woman presently crossing the palace would not arrive as a subject, even though his father had acted as king. She would show up as a wife who had just discovered that the man who had protected her from the world had turned out to be the one who had taken her away from it. No one was more aware of the peril of such a gathering than William. A constitutional ruling would turn into something much messier and more difficult to contain, an open family war, with just one careless word and one charge that was too harsh to retract. The outer world may still be attempting to comprehend what Camilla had lost. A more terrifying question was already being posed by some inside the palace. As a result, what would everyone else be compelled to disclose, give up, or transform into? Charles was left by himself after the meeting. He took off his glasses, put his fingers to his eyes, and gazed at the declaration as though it were someone else's. Stability, not sentiment, is what a crown wants. He was aware of that. It was something he had known for years. However, understanding a theory does not equate to overcoming its repercussions. He had put up with scandal, mockery, and criticism the majority of his adult life because of Camilla. When loyalty cost him dearly, he had stayed faithful. When public sentiment made her loyalty extremely unpopular, he had stood with her. He had witnessed her struggle through rejection and, in defiance of all expectations, come out not only accepted but crowned. And now he was the only one with the strength to undo that triumph. Being queen had never been all about status for Camilla. Outsiders were unable to understand that. They saw it as a title, a formality, and a polished public persona. However, it meant that she had survived years of shame. It was the last response to everyone who had previously thought she would never be accepted by the institution itself and would always be outside the gates, maybe tolerated in whispers. She had suffered the slow pain of public memory, as well as ridicule, rage, and disdain. Rising next to Charles had changed her place in the past, but it had not erased it. Therefore, relinquishing that position did not feel like a change in responsibilities. It was as though she had only received conditional acceptance despite everything. Employees in her rooms offered to help. She turned it all down. She would only talk to Charles. There was more to that determination than just rage. It was an assertion. No secretary, advisor, or well-crafted justification from a court official could have stood in their way if he had gotten this directly from her. She had relied on his protection at the darkest times of her public life. She had to find out now why that protection had disappeared. Not moved, not diminished, disappeared. William paused outside the door. Once he heard her strained, low voice, and then there was silence once more. He had long forgotten memories of her presence in the family that had never completely subsided. However, as he stood there, he sensed something that troubled him nearly as much as the announcement. Not just sympathy, conflict, because you may still shudder at the sound of someone breaking, even if you don't like them or even hate them. He lifted his hand to tap, then brought it down again. He would be entering a private battleground between his father's duty and his father's heart, something no future monarch should ever choose to inherit personally. A revised itinerary was given to Catherine somewhere. It appeared to be standard palace planning at first view. She then noticed the names. Camilla was now reassigned a number of ceremonial responsibilities. A few were designated for Catherine. She became motionless. A public royal position is never merely an occasion. Every appearance conveys a narrative. Every procession, every philanthropic visit, and every position in queue reveals to the nation who is important, who is emerging, who is disappearing, and who can be relied upon to maintain continuity. Catherine immediately knew what this would entail. She would repeatedly show up as the benefactor of another woman's breakdown. The pictures would speak before the facts, even if she had done nothing to find it. William instantly agreed when she told him she didn't want to celebrate. However, he was also aware of the reality she was attempting to conceal. Silence itself might be seen as ambition in royal life. Some might refer to her peaceful acceptance of the increased responsibilities as grace. Some would refer to it as strategy. There was no easy way out of this. Then Anne pulled William away. She cautioned him that a single disagreement or a single poor morning had not made this issue worse. It had been carefully and gently growing in the darkness. He needed to return to a private ceremony at Windsor, to a moment so little on the surface that anyone outside the family would have completely missed its significance if he was to comprehend why Charles had finally done what so many said he would never do. Anne claims that a chair, rather than yelling, was what really made a difference. Long before that day, the tension had been rising. Camilla had been discreetly but strongly advocating for the preservation of household positions, power patronages, and symbolic closeness to the heart of royal life. At the same time, William and Catherine were becoming closer to the throne's future, not because they wanted it, but rather because time was passing. Few people outside the facility truly comprehend what Charles feared. Within a monarchy, conflicting power centers lead to uncertainty, which ultimately erodes authority. One unambiguous chain of continuity is required by the sovereign. However, Camilla was growing more and more concerned that clarity might obliterate her as Charles attempted to make the future simpler. During a private investiture planning meeting at Windsor Castle, that anxiety came to light. Written agreements had been made. At a crucial ceremonial occasion, Catherine was to occupy the central chair, a subtle but clear indication of the monarchy's next stage. The order was sealed. It was recognized. It wasn't an inevitable mishap. However, Camilla came in, walked across the room, and claimed that chair for herself before the session officially started. She remained motionless when an attendant inquired in a low voice if there had been a miscommunication. She rested both hands on the chair's arms. No voice was raised. Not a dramatic scenario. Simply a rejection. Catherine hesitated as she emerged in the doorway. She grasped it right away. The room did as well. It was more than just a seating problem. It was difficult. Unmistakable to anyone who knew ceremonial language, but not yet public. In royal life, a person's position can be just as important as their words. This was Camilla's nonverbal declaration that she would not gracefully disappear into the background of someone else's future. Shortly later, William came in and noticed Catherine move aside. He was quickly overcome with rage, but Catherine's quiet prevented him from escalating the insult into a confrontation. She was aware that a single quarrel would lead to something more significant, ugly, and uncontrollable. Nevertheless, the harm had been done. Every previous moment is altered once such a challenge is seen by the wrong people, even in private. It challenges people to consider what other, more subdued boundaries have previously been crossed. Charles personally confronted Camilla following the event. He questioned why she had disregarded a clear directive, according to the internal report that was ultimately shared among the most senior royals. Her response sliced right through the formalities. She claimed that if she did not defend her position, the impatience of the younger generation would render her invisible. This was honesty to her. It sounded quite different to Charles. It sounded like a caution. His marriage and the succession seemed to be at odds with one another. Furthermore, affection becomes harmful when a king feels that his personal life is jeopardizing the crown's future order. When Anne presented Charles with a file detailing past incidents in which members of Camilla's sphere had changed, postponed, or subtly twisted ceremonial instructions, her anxiety grew. In isolation, a few adjustments were insignificant. This is a rearranged position. There was a delayed confirmation. An interpretation that was offered as a courtesy turned out to be advantageous. However, they created a pattern when placed side by side. Anne then gestured to Windsor's updated seating cards. There was no uncertainty at the last minute. Before anyone showed up, the challenge had been planned. Charles no longer saw Windsor as a misunderstanding after that. He called Camilla to his study in the absence of counselors. Like evidence in a trial that neither of them wanted, the modified seating chart rested on the desk between them. Charles wasn't angry at first. She was more disturbed by that than by rage. One can respond to fury. Grief is more difficult. He posed a query that eliminated all of their titles, tactics, and cautious public stances. Had she ever really meant to respect the future he was attempting to create? He wasn't just inquiring about a chair. He wanted to know if the Windsor Act had been a panicked moment or if it revealed something more, a resolve to maintain her own status, even if it meant opposing the following generation's symbolic ascent. He had stood up for her through years of public danger, scandal, and animosity. She had gone into that chamber thinking she was still shielded by history. Knowing that history could no longer serve as a shield, he entered it. Camilla did not act uninformed when Charles asked if she had approved of Catherine's relocation after sliding the seating map across the desk. She acknowledged that she was aware of the plans. She contended that her queenship would become cosmetic, meaningless, and reduced to a title without force if she gave up all outward indications of seniority. To get there, she had battled for too long. She was aware that the future was drawing near, yet she was determined to keep smiling. She was hurt by Charles's response because it was so blatantly obvious. The throne, he claimed, was never intended to demonstrate their devotion. He claimed that although he still loved her, he could not let love take precedence over succession. The man who had previously disregarded public indignation on her behalf was speaking as a sovereign first and a spouse second at that precise moment. After flinching, Camilla took off a royal brooch and placed it next to the seating arrangement. It was a tiny but powerful gesture. Jewelry is rarely just jewelry in royal life. Allegiance, rank, inheritance, and belonging can all be represented by a brooch. She informed him that he couldn't demand that she wear the symbols of authority while denying her access to them. Because it was partially accurate, the charge struck deeply. Charles desired form's dignity without the chaos of rivalry. He desired tranquility. She desired to be present. He then accessed Anne's file. Official documents of unapproved conversations between Camilla's office and ceremonial planners were found inside, indicating that the Windsor modification had been the result of a larger effort, rather than an emotional outburst in the room. Camilla asserted that William's side was constructing evidence against her. Before she could muster any strength, Charles stopped her. He claimed that his son had not made the recommendation. It had originated with him. The previous defense failed at that point. Camilla got to her feet. She didn't plead. She didn't offer an apology. She didn't ask for forgiveness. After leaving the brooch on the desk, she exited and shut the door. Charles didn't call the constitutional secretary and give the order that would turn a private break into an official royal act until her footsteps had vanished. Even yet, a single signature was insufficient to support the order. Coalitions of duty, discipline, optics, and quiet assent are what keep a monarchy afloat. A group of people who had reached the same conclusion for quite different reasons stood behind Charles. William desired consistency. Catherine wished to avoid being the obvious victor of a conflict that she had not requested to inherit. Principle was what Anne desired. Edward wanted the family to adjust to the upheaval without becoming further divided. Although each had a different motivation, they were all aware of the same reality. The conflict over authority and influence would only worsen in the future if Camilla's role was not curtailed today. Charles did not conceal himself behind polite language when they reconvened. The repercussions were described by the constitutional secretary. Camilla's ceremonial appearance, domestic authority, public obligations, and official access might all be rearranged, but her marriage could not simply be dissolved by decree. The family members in attendance weren't only there to observe the directive. The practical redistribution of responsibilities, public pressure, internal animosity, media storms, and emotional aftershocks were all part of what they were there to absorb. When Catherine realized how many responsibilities would fall to her, she turned pale. It wasn't a present. Exposure was the cause. Every gathering she went to in Camilla's place would spark rumors. Every picture would be examined for a secret victory. His wife must never seem to have desired any of it, William emphasized, leaning forward. He was afraid that the public's sympathy for Camilla would turn into mistrust of Catherine, ruining the very future they were supposed to ensure. But Anne would not soften the reasoning. She claimed that protecting Camilla from repercussions at this point would undermine the kingdom and give the impression that Charles is unable to punish even those closest to him. Only when those closest to authority are not excluded does it persist. Edward didn't say much, but what he did say was significant. His backing demonstrated that this was no longer merely theoretical. The balance of the family was being recalculated. The worst practical terms were then disclosed by advisors. Central approval would be needed for Camilla's public appearances and home appointments. Her communications team would use royal channels to make statements. Access would become more limited. Independence would decline. In order to avoid reversal during times of illness, mental stress, or temporary retreat, Charles even signed a secondary order. Setting down the pen, he turned to face William and issued a warning that sounded more like a lesson in statecraft than a father's viewpoint. A future monarch must never mistake love for constitutional obligation. The old order had started to fall apart by the time Camilla's senior assistant was told to empty a portion of an office suite before sundown. It wasn't a headline that initially revealed her new reality. It was not there. Her schedule was empty. Engagements disappeared. The delivery of briefing folders ceased. The employees who used to visit her rooms every morning were moved to another location. Invitations that needed her presence were rescheduled or rerouted. The abrupt cessation of movement was more cruel than a public dispute for a woman who had spent decades gaining institutional prominence. Silence frequently causes greater humiliation in palaces than rejection. She went into her office and came to a halt. Like silent witnesses to a life being folded away, archival boxes stood next to the desk. The rooms had to be cleared out before dusk, an aide stated. At first, Camilla refused to touch anything. It would be like agreeing to the verdict if she packed it herself. Her official court date had already passed. All communications with the outside world now have to go through the Central Palace office, according to instructions given to her staff. Her remarks need approval as well. The assistant started taking out the framed pictures one by one. Camilla remained silent until the woman came to a private portrait of Charles. Then she went across the room, retrieved it, and pressed it to her chest. The crisis's most profound contradiction was exposed at that precise moment. Her world had always been linked to the same man whose order was destroying it. There was another folder. Drafts of letters notifying public organizations and charity that Catherine or Sophie will henceforth represent the crown at future occasions were contained within. Slowly, Camilla turned the pages. The same point was conveyed differently by each substitution. Her absence had no symbolic meaning. It was working. It would be kept up. When she arrived at the schedule for a significant state ceremony, she discovered that the admission order had been altered. She would no longer walk next to Charles. This was no longer a private loss. It would be put on display for the country to see. At that moment, something inside her solidified. Humiliation has its limit, not because the anguish had subsided. It frequently becomes a colder kind of resolve after that point. She looked at the door when she heard a noise outside the half-cleared office. Beneath it, Charles's shadow paused. She thought for a split second that he didn't. Rather, a handwritten note was provided later. At morning, he requested her to meet him in the tiny garden room. The buildings surrounding her had been destroyed by royal might by dusk. By daybreak, Charles would have to confront her without consultants, without paperwork, and without the shield of protocol. By royal standards, the garden room was empty. No secretaries, no uniforms, and no family members ready to step in. Charles was the first to arrive. A few minutes later, Camilla came in with the picture she had saved from the office. They stood in front of each other, devoid of all roles save the oldest, for the first time since the announcement. They were neither consort nor sovereign. After the crown had already demanded its payment, they were two individuals attempting to find out if love could endure the crown. Since the order had resolved her status but not their marriage, Charles had requested the meeting. Duties, residences, and public precedents can all be established by royal authority. It is impossible to ascertain whether trust endures in private. Camilla didn't show up to demand reparations. Beneath the order, she came for the response. She set the picture down on the table and inquired as to whether he had acted because he no longer trusted her or because he thought she had irreparably disgraced the monarchy. Charles didn't hide behind formalities. He expressed his continued affection for her. However, he claimed that love could not justify behavior that prioritized their relationship over the institution's cohesion and succession planning. Any challenge to succession runs the risk of turning personal rivalry into instability inside the country. It was more than just hurt sentiments amongst ladies. It concerned the future that the monarchy was portending. After listening, Camilla revealed what pride had been hiding. Fear had become the source of her stubbornness. She felt herself being gently erased in favor of the future after enduring too much animosity to get to this point. To her, Catherine's ascent did not seem like a logical progression. It appeared to be the ultimate substitute for everything she had battled to keep alive. Defiance was what Charles had anticipated. Instead, he heard something more susceptible and, in a sense, more hazardous. A confession that action had been motivated by dread. Then Camilla took an unexpected action. She said that she would no longer be vying for Catherine's future position. She declined to participate in the ceremonial competition. She didn't ask for a secret pledge or a reversal. There is no way back, no private agreement, just clarity. She received it from Charles. She would continue to be his spouse. She would maintain her dignity and a secure private residence. However, she would not regain her official position as queen. The line was that. Camilla took the brooch out of her coat, handed it to Charles, and stated the crown should determine its proper place. Neither grinned, neither immediately left. They stayed there with the creature that power had almost destroyed and possibly saved in a different form. The palace prepared the complete announcement a few hours later. The news had reached every wall by breakfast. The story was broadcast on television panels, radio bulletins, newspaper kiosks, and train station screens. It was referred to by some as a royal discipline. Some referred to it as a husband sacrificing his wife in order to save the organization. More than any commentary, a single image started to capture the spirit of the country. The void next to the king. On his own, Charles watched the first television bulletin. Broadcasters clarified that although Camilla would no longer act as queen ceremonially or in public, she would still be his wife. Analysts split nearly immediately. The decision demonstrated to some that the monarchy could hold its own members responsible. For others, it revealed a family breakup that was too terrible to be justified. When a presenter called Camilla the most personal victim of his reign, Charles turned off the television. Crowds gathered in the rain outside Buckingham Palace. Some came out of devotion, some out of curiosity, and some because they thought they were seeing one of those times when a monarchy begins to look human instead of eternal. A woman placed a tiny bouquet next to the gates. No family should have to pay this much for a crown, according to another. Their remarks permeated live coverage and expanded on the main query. Had Charles stood up for the institution, or had he caused irreversible harm to the woman who had supported him over the years when few others would? Through filtered reports, Camilla heard both the supporters and the detractors. Every time someone asked her for a comment, she declined. That quiet was important. Dignified retreat could be transformed into overt disobedience with just one irate reply from her. However, silence was harsh in and of itself. It exposed her legacy to those who wanted to define it. The announcement of Catherine's first reassigned appearance increased the pressure. Catherine would now represent the crown at a nationwide charity service that was originally planned for Camilla. William instantly gave his crew instructions. No festivities, no triumphant language, not a single briefing that suggested victory. Catherine's ascent could not seem to be based on the humiliation of another woman. He maintained that the monarchy should project stability rather than conquest. Charles realized that the nation would now interpret movement as meaning as he got ready for the family's first public appearance under the new regime. Where he was standing, she strolled next to him. Who didn't? Every palace window had been flooded with public criticism, but only this appearance would reveal the true meaning of his declaration. Charles hesitated before emerging from his private quarters when the time came. There was weight to the void next to him. He moved forward by himself into the sovereign's position after steadying himself against a table. There was a piercing, even brutal hush all around him. The purpose of a governmental service is to demonstrate power and continuity. It showed the price that day. Catherine moved farther back in the procession, taking on a role she had not previously pursued due to the demise of another woman. William remained by her side. He realized that greater responsibility had come via suffering rather than success. Camilla listened in private apartments somewhere without the jewelry and emblems that once signified her status, without ceremonial insignia. Camilla did not become enraged when Catherine assumed her role. The moment's finality was sufficient. She stopped contesting succession. She was no longer in opposition to the future monarch and his spouse. However, grief does not go away just because resistance ceases. Anne stood beside Charles following the service. She remained silent, but her presence served as a reminder of the cost of making the most difficult decision. Yes, he had regained his clarity. However, he had also permanently altered the trust in his marriage. Now the family realized something they would always remember. Only when personal ambition does not jeopardize continuity do titles survive. Camilla was waiting for Charles when he got back to the private apartment. No officials were present. Reinstatement is not discussed. There are no more arguments to be made. He sat next to her and she grasped his hand. Her importance had not been diminished by him. Their past had not been obliterated by him. However, he had prioritized the crown's survival over the future she had envisioned for herself within it. It was the end of her reign beside him. Somehow their bond wasn't. And more than the announcement itself, that was the reality that startled Britain. This was hardly the typical breakdown of a marriage. A common royal destiny came to an end. Charles retained his throne. Camilla managed to maintain her dignity. The monarchy maintained law and order. However, nothing was left unaltered. Love endured but changed. Despite being exposed, power managed to endure. The family changed, yet they survived. The palace did not collapse in a single spectacular blast. It gradually, almost beautifully, shifted on its foundations, as old organizations frequently do when they must give up something intimate in order to protect something greater. However, the crack was visible to everyone who looked closely. It passed through the king, Camilla, William, and Catherine, Anne's unwavering discipline, and every place where people had previously thought that public duty and private allegiance could coexist indefinitely. They were unable to. The moment would therefore endure long after the headlines had faded, not because a ceremonial role was diminished or a title was transferred. However, the country had witnessed something much more disturbing than etiquette. It had witnessed a monarch reject the woman who had spent years assisting him in gaining the throne. It had seen a family injure itself in order to maintain continuity. And it had discovered in the coldest way possible that the most perilous conflicts are not necessarily conducted in public within a palace. They can start out silently. Occasionally, they start with a chair. Sometimes the true pain has already occurred behind closed doors by the time the world hears the announcement.